to the FSC ReGenerations Reimagined Conference, He Waka Ekanoa, Reimagined for 2021. Kia ora tātou, ko Russell Hutchinson tāku ingoa. Ke Chatswood Consulting ho I Mahiana, no England, Scotland, aku tupuna. Tēnā koutou katoa. And it's now my pleasure to obviously thank our sponsors and to welcome our panel to the session. Today's session, to recap on my mihi, my name is Russell Hutchinson of Chatswood Consulting, and you can probably tell from my poor pronunciation of Te Reo that I am from the UK. So welcome to you all, whether you're watching this session live or you're viewing it as a recording later. We have a really exciting panel of people to share with you today, and I'd like to invite them to start their microphones and start their video. First of all, our panel is here to consider the protection gap. The protection gap is a name we prefer to the rather cumbersome underinsurance. It's the main way that people in our industry care about ensuring customers have sufficient protection, or to keep an eye on how much insurance is bought rather than what is needed. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our guests. First of all, Kresh Wright, who is Head of Life and Health for New Zealand at SwissRe. Swiss has done some awesome research on the subject, and we're going to learn a bit more about that in just a few minutes. Tony Arthur is Chief Commercial Officer at Partners Life and brings a perspective of a leading product provider, as well as a company that very much has the views of advisors to bring to this discussion. Dr. Claire Matthews is an Associate Professor and Director of Academic Quality at Massey University. Dr. Claire can tell us more about the work that has been done to assess the extent of the protection gap in New Zealand as part of the work Massey University and her colleagues did for the Financial Services Council. So first up, may I ask each of you to introduce yourselves and to tell us why the protection gap is of interest to you and how you've been keeping track of the issue over the last few years.
Kia ora tātou, ko Kresh taku ingoa. Kei SwissRe aho, e mahi ana, I tipu ake aho ki te whanganui a tara. Tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kresh Wright, and I'm really pleased to be with you all this morning. It's bright and early here in Sydney, where I'm based. And as Russell mentioned, I'm currently responsible for SwissRe's life and health business in New Zealand. So I first came across the concept of a protection gap many years ago, probably about 15 years ago, when I first started working for SwissRe. And what caught my attention was really the sheer magnitude of the numbers that were being calculated. SwissRe has calculated the protection gap across many different risks and across many different markets globally. So I've had some great exposure to seeing what those numbers look like. For me, I'm particularly passionate about the protection gap in life insurance, of course, but also understanding why consumers don't tend to buy life insurance cover and what drives that. The other thing I'm really passionate about is about reaching vulnerable customers, so customers who might not have had access to insurance in the past, and how can we solve the problem and bridge that gap for these customers. I am also a very proud Kiwi, so the gap in New Zealand is of course particularly important to me.
And how about you, Dr. Claire? Would you like to share with us how you've been tracking the gap too and what your interest is there?
So I guess I was kind of aware of the gap for a while, but it really came to the forefront when I did the work for Financial Services Council 10 years ago in terms of the report on underinsurance in New Zealand with my colleagues. And that just highlighted what an issue it is. It is of interest because it significantly links through to the work I do around financial literacy, because that has a significant impact and a relationship with the decisions they make around insurance, and it's some of those decisions that lead to underinsurance. But also it links into the work I do in relation to retirement preparation, because obviously a significant adverse event can have a huge impact on the preparation that you have done for retirement. Mm. And so you might be ticking along on this really good path, and then you get to retirement or you get to this adverse event and it has an impact. And so it's an interest in terms of how it has that impact in other aspects of life, not just underinsurance in pure terms.
Fantastic. And Tony, what's your interest in the subject?
Kia ora, Russell, Claire and Kresh. I guess I've had the privilege of working in financial services for about the last 15 years, both in banking and then the last 4 with Partners Life. And in reality, in the roles that I've been lucky enough to have, I've seen the consequences of the protection gap firsthand. I guess a significant part of my interest also stems a little bit about, from my why, I guess. I've been lucky enough to work for companies in roles which have the ability to be able to impact and influence it, to a little bit of what Claire is saying, not just the protection gap, but the wider issue of financial literacy. And I've got a couple of young sons, and to be blunt, I want to see them grow up and have opportunities that I haven't had. And, if I'm going to play any role in that, then I've got to put my shoulder on the wheel in that regard.
Awesome. So perhaps we go to you, Dr. Claire, first. Can you tell us about what the protection gap is and what are some of the ways that you measure that?
Okay. So at one level, it would sound like that's a really easy question, but of course, it's never as easy as it sounds. In simple terms, the insurance or the protection gap refers to having less cover than is needed to protect against adverse financial events. And it does actually take 2 forms. Protection gap can be in the form of having absolutely no insurance, but and arguably the more important issue is actually having insufficient insurance to cover for those events. In terms of defining adequate cover so that you can identify whether the level of insurance is sufficient, that's where it really comes down to. And it's not easily done. And there's a whole range of ways in which a protection gap can arise. So it might be that you don't have enough conditions covered, for example. So, for example, you might have health and disability or trauma and disability insurance, but if you don't cover enough conditions, then you have a condition come along that you're not covered for, and so the insurance doesn't provide you with that cover that you thought you had. It might be that the excesses are too high, so that what your contribution is to any situation that arises, you actually can't afford. And you may have taken a higher excess in order to reduce the premiums, but it can become counterproductive. It may be that the actual coverage is insufficient. So in terms of determining how much cover you need, for example, for income protection to provide the replacement income, if you haven't made that calculation correctly, then you might have some income coming in, but it's not as much as you should have had. Or in the worst case, it's some combination of those. So in terms of measurements, a measurement can be done at a national level or at an individual level. And nationally, it's kind of big picture stuff. So it might be via insurance penetration, which is the percentage of insurance premiums to GDP, or it might be via insurance density, which is the ratio of insurance premiums to the total population. That has a value, but it's really doesn't tell you the detailed picture which you really need, because really what's important is what the protection gap is at an individual level. And so in that case, you need to say, what is the amount of cover that is required to be adequate? And there's adequate and then there's full coverage. So adequate is it'll be enough. Full coverage is it's absolutely sufficient. And if you've got a protection gap, for example, and I'll use house insurance just because it's a really simple example. If you've got a protection gap in terms of your house insurance, then you won't be able to rebuild your house when it burns down in a fire. You'll get some money back from your insurance company, but you're not going to be able to have anything like the house that you had before. From a personal perspective, if you haven't got sufficient cover, then when an adverse event happens, a death, serious illness, and you can't able to work, it means you've got to make substantial changes to your lifestyle. So perhaps your children are offered a private boarding school. They can no longer do that. The regular holidays that you took, you're no longer able to do. Maybe you can't continue to live in the house that you have been in because you can't afford the loan repayments. So when you're looking at it at an individual level, the protection gap really is individual and different for each individual and person, which makes it, and couple, which makes it really hard. And it's really hard to get information about understanding that because it's quite a complicated calculation to do.
That sounds like the set of issues that advisors are dealing with all the time, and in quite a lot of detail. And but going back to what you said about assessing the protection gap, perhaps at a higher level, I'd like to turn now over to you, Kresh. And I know Swiss has done quite a lot of research in this area quite recently. Can you tell us what you found and share with us a little bit about how New Zealand stands from an international comparison?
Yeah, sure. And that's right. So earlier this year, Russell, we did a survey in New Zealand. We talked to 750 Kiwis, and we did look specifically at the mortality protection gap and what that looks like in New Zealand. So unfortunately, we didn't look at the health or disability or trauma side, but focused on mortality. And I might also add, before I go into some of the numbers here, that the way SwissRe defines the protection gap is that we look at the income, first of all, that's required to maintain a household's living standard, and also to pay off any debt in the event of their primary earner in that household. And then we deduct the available financial resources for that household. So that could be savings, other assets, and of course, any existing insurance as well. So first up, I guess there's four big numbers I wanted to talk about on the left-hand side. The first one is the size of the mortality protection gap, which we quantified at a massive $670 billion. And what that really says is that if we could take out a life insurance policy with a sum assured of 670 billion New Zealand dollars, that would cover all of us sufficiently. The second number there is the gap as a percentage of the protection need, and we've put that at 55%. So again, a big number, and essentially we're saying we need to roughly double the amount of life cover in New Zealand to sufficiently protect everyone. 64% of Kiwi households are underprotected. That, again, that's a big number who don't have enough to see them through in the event of the death of their key earner. And then the one that I guess shocked me the most is that last one. 20% of our households have a gap of more than 90%. So these households pretty much have nothing to rely on in the event of death of their primary earner. So over on the right-hand side, we've got a nice little comparison of what New Zealand looks like against some of the other countries where we've calculated a mortality protection gap. First of all, looking at the number itself, so this is in US dollars, I'm afraid, but New Zealand's sitting down there on the right-hand side at 0.4 billion US dollars, and that doesn't look too bad, really, against everyone else. But what that really reflects is the size of the New Zealand population, which is very small, of course, compared to the likes of China, India, Japan. And even when you compare against Australia, that population is roughly 5 to 6 times New Zealand. So that protection gap there you can see is roughly 5 to 6 times the New Zealand gap. What I think is probably a more useful comparison is that that percentage, the gap as a percentage of the protection need. You can see there New Zealand sitting at 55%, and again, not looking too bad when you compare against the likes of Australia, which is a little bit lower, but Singapore as well, which has a very similar population size, we're roughly the same. With some of the more emerging markets in Asia, of course, we're doing a lot better, which is good to see. So, I mean, in one line, I suppose I would say the gap for New Zealand is significant. There's a lot of work to do, but you're in the same ballpark as the likes of Australia.
Nice. I had a quick look with my calculator while you were talking there, and it seems that protection gap, once we divide that 670 billion by about a population of a working age population of about 3.5 million, then we get to a gap of around $200,000 per person. Although, of course, as you pointed out, some people have nothing, and some people will have around what's required. And every now and then we bump into somebody that has a little bit more, although that seems to be very rare.
Yes.
So look, at this, we're going to open this up and get around our panel now a bit more. And so especially you sort of understanding how the gap differs between the national level and the individual level. I think that's a good point of departure. And Tony, let's go to you and say, well, what are you finding about this?
So look, I think first of all, to acknowledge, Kresh, your research, your firm's research, Claire and the FSC, we've got a number of data points now which all confirm the same thing. We've all, approximately stated that, the underinsurance gap is almost 50% of what's currently there at a population level. And I think, it's important that we continue to communicate that. I think it's important that we size the problem and make sure that not just the industry, but government and others understand the flow and impact on this. But I'll be a little, I guess, blunt. Whilst I think it's often, important that we size it, it's not till we're able to package that information down to an individual level, which I think we absolutely struggle to. And it's not just getting that gap and the consequences of the gap down to individuals. It's how do we get that messaging and that understanding in the right form so that it gets to the right people, the people that aren't currently protected or are grossly underprotected, and in a way that enables them to both understand that but motivates them for change. And I think that's one of the key issues that we face into at the moment. Some of these statistics aren't new. This issue isn't new, and we've been kicking this ball around as an industry for a while now, and somehow we need a circuit breaker to be able to go, how do we make this information relevant to an individual? Because as I say, at a national level, the statistics, in my view, continue to be alarming. We see the consequences of what happens when people's lives are interrupted. And it's not, as Claire said, it's not just death, it's, critical illness. It's when people's incomes, at a household level are impacted. But we need to be able to personalise this information down if we're going to be able to make progress in being actually able to help solve the issue that lies in front of us.
Fantastic, thank you. And Claire, again, zooming back down into that individual level, what are you finding there, and how does it vary perhaps between segments?
So it vary between
segments, different
segment
households and so
on. Yeah, so there's definitely differences between segments, but it's a little bit hard to be clear on that. There are people for whom the reality is insurance is simply actually unnecessary because they will get support from other things. But it's about helping them understand that those other things may not be sufficient. For example, there's a lack of understanding around ACC and the coverage that provides. And you see all the different stories. You'll see a newspaper story, for those of us who still get newspapers, otherwise you see it online, where somebody's had this disaster and then there's a give a little page set up for them because they didn't have the coverage that they needed. So I'm not sure that there's truly a segment. It does tend to be there does tend to be a financial element to that, because the reality is that part of the reason that people don't have sufficient insurance is the cost. Although to some extent what they're doing is it's a false economy. It's a bit like KiwiSaver. And so the issue is that they need to actually understand what the issues are. And it's that understanding that I think we really need to be working on.
Fantastic. And Kresh, do you have a view down at the individual level as well?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm fully on board with Tony's view. I think this has been a long-known problem, and I think now it's all about us as an industry alongside the government as well, looking at how we understand each individual New Zealander and how we can help everyone with their own personal situation, because even in our research it was clear that every individual has their own personal preferences, their own personal risk tolerances as well, and behaviours that drive what they do and how they act, and what risks they're willing to live with as well. So it's really, I think, about getting that awareness out there, the education out there, and being able to tailor to the individual situations. I might also add, I mean, one of the things that came out of our research is what we call the perception gap, and that is, all about this awareness, not only awareness, but the fact that quite often, even though individuals are aware that they need insurance, they very often underestimate the amount of insurance they need, and they underestimate the financial consequences and the financial impact that the death of or other event can have on their household or their family unit, and sometimes even more widely than just their family as well. So I think, if we can understand our customers better, if we can really tailor products, get the education out there, I think we should be able to bridge both the protection and the perception gap.
Yeah,
So if I can can I just throw a comment in? So Kresh made the comment about the risks that people are prepared to accept, and I think that's true. But the problem is that at the time that you're talking to them about insurance, they say, "Yeah, I'm prepared to accept that risk," because and it comes back to the perception issue that Kresh was talking about, because they don't fully understand what that risk actually means in practical terms. And so in theory, they say, yeah, that's fine, I'll accept that risk. But when it comes down to it and that risk is realised, they actually suddenly realise that actually they shouldn't have accepted that risk and it wasn't a good move. But by then it's too late.
By then it's too late. Yeah, hindsight is 20/20. So that perception gap and what the risk really means. I think I've also heard Tony mention a couple of times, understanding the consequences. So, Tony, what do the gaps mean in real life to clients? What kinds of consequences are seen when there are large gaps?
Well, I think in reality, Russell, we only ever see a glimpse of what this means at an aggregate level. I mean, Claire, you touched on, the Give a Little page, and how often is it that we see media articles around, the personal situations of Kiwis, where themselves, families, or whatever are having to raise money because of a situation where, again, they either have no or inadequate, cover for themselves to be able to handle what has happened. It's very difficult, as I think the people listening today will know, for people to improve their financial overall well-being if there is no ability not ability is the wrong words, those people are struggling to get access to the right information to actually be confronted with what those consequences are, Russell. And I think it's both for myself and the partner's life, and for everybody else here who's working for a company to understand what is it that they can be doing to actually make this a lot more real. And you asked the question of so what does a gap mean? I mean, to be blunt, it's massive. You're talking the loss of financial well-being to an individual household. You're talking about the loss of future prospects, certainly an opportunity. You're talking about people whose current and future lifestyle is materially changed. And I look at in some ways we can talk about externalities, but in some ways it's good to internalize this. My mother passed away 16 years ago from breast cancer. My father was an electrician, had his own small business, and if it wasn't for seeing the impact that insurance played for him at that point of time in allowing him to transition and get through what he needed to get through, if he didn't have that there, the consequences for both him and his business would have been manifestly worse. And I bring it to my own situation. 10 odd days ago, I got a malignant melanoma diagnosis. Now, don't really wish to, share that with the world, but you've got to bring it home to make it real. In reality, I think hopefully at the moment the pathology says that's early stage, but if I look at my own household that I'm sitting in here, I am the main income earner. And if I didn't have, the covers, if the diagnosis, isn't a good one, then for my wife and my children that I've spoken about before, the impacts are real, and I'm not prepared to accept them, and I'm lucky enough to have the cover. But we need to get that sense of realness down to the people that don't have it, and at the moment we are all failing at that.
Wow, that really brings it home, Tony. And thank you for sharing that. That's a powerful reminder. None of us are bulletproof, and these things can happen to everybody. And so, like you say, we really need to be able to bring that home to people. Claire, what are you seeing in terms of trying to bring those consequences home to people?
I probably can't really add much more to what Tony said, but perhaps I'll also add a personal story just to highlight the types of issues. So my brother died in his early 40s of cancer about 10 years ago. Now, fortunately, he didn't have children. He was in a fairly new relationship, and so they weren't their financials weren't quite so intertwined. But at the same time, he owned shares in a small business, and what he hadn't understood, and they didn't have business insurance that they should have had. So the business was able to continue, but he wasn't able to continue working in it because he got too ill. So he couldn't get an income directly from that. He got some shareholder type income. But he had this expectation that as having an ownership share, that his partner would still get a substantial payout. But that's not how that works. At one level, if you don't understand the finances, it can be quite difficult to understand. But he just assumed that, the business was worth X, and so that would be paid out. And that's not how it worked, and his partner didn't get much. Now, as I say, it wasn't catastrophic in that case, but in a different situation, it could have been, because, had he had children, his insurance situation possibly wouldn't have been any different. Possibly he would have got some good advice and got that changed, but potentially he could have been in a substantially different situation. So there was that lack of understanding from a business perspective about what was needed. But beyond that, I can't really add to what Tony said. I think he's covered it really well.
Yeah, no, I think there is definitely some common themes emerging about people needing help to understand exactly how these things are going to work out, and to make those consequences real. Kresh, something from you on consequences.
Yeah, and I would say, just to add to the thoughts there around, the secondary impacts to families and to our kids of this stuff. First of all, you have to deal with the actual trauma or the death or whatever it is to begin with and come to terms with that. But then you're left facing a critical financial position in addition to that. And in a lot of cases, this can just leave families with literally nothing. Then of course, I guess then there are possible impacts, mental health and things as well that could come out of this as well. So, I mean, I think the reality is that, that having insurance, having sufficient coverage or not, could drastically change the course of a family's kind of life path, and I think, and even beyond just the immediate family as well, and just in terms of sharing stories, and I thank you, Tony, and thank you, Claire, for sharing those stories, because I think that's exactly what we need to do, is to share those stories, and these are actually good news stories that we need to share and we don't hear enough of, and it's good news stories that really that touch people and help them to understand the worth of insurance.
So I think we feel pretty strongly about the protection gap, and I see there's a couple of questions from the audience, and we're sort of heading into the zone where we want to talk about what we can do about this and the solutions that we can bring to it. So, but just to make sure that we understand this, so what are the main source or scope for protection gaps to emerge, and are there any particular sales channels or processes that we need to be particularly mindful of when considering the gaps? Because it sounds like those are probably crucial in coming up with good answers. Who's my first victim?
Russell, I'll jump in first. I think I guess I've got two views on this. I think when I've talked to people across the industry about this, when we talk about channels, often the sort of, not the finger is pointed at the independent advisor market, but there seems to be a rhetoric that advisors, won't necessarily focus on particular areas of the community, where there might be higher levels of insurance gap, and I think that's too broad a brush to paint. When I look at the advisors, that we work closely with at Partners Life, absolutely, I see a broad spectrum of advice businesses who focus on different areas of the community, and many successful advice firms, which focus in on communities where access to information or, intergenerational family education around the importance of both growing wealth but also protecting that wealth may not necessarily be as strong as others. I see advice firms that are successfully building in there. I do absolutely believe, however, and I've touched on the communication piece, but I think both at a product and a technology level, we as an industry, and certainly, we have a large investment slate at Partners Life, and it's a critical part of our strategy, trying to work through how do we build an opportunity to engage people that do not access and struggle for whatever reason to get access to the right insurance product. How do we make sure that we can both communicate with them around the need, but make sure that we have both product and a technology that makes that an effective engagement, and put them onto the pathway, hopefully, of lifelong protection. Again, because remember, the protection gap is only one aspect of a person's financial well-being. It's, how do they ensure the protection of the lifestyle that they have, but also protect their longer-term selves. I think also I take, I have an optimistic view. I look at people like Kendall Flutie and what Banker is doing in the education system. I don't think it's necessarily just commercial companies, providers like ourselves that need to be solving this. I think, with advisors, for example, I think, I look at a fresh startup like Banker and the difference that they're making at a younger generation, even before they've finished the schooling process, to make sure that those education awareness levels are there. We then need to obligate ourselves to make sure that we are at the point when those people come through that education, to make sure that we can get the product that they need at that point.
Awesome, thanks. And Dr. Claire, anything for you in terms of how those gaps emerge? I know that, for instance, Massey is responsible for a lot of advisor education in this area.
So in terms of how the gaps occur, there's just so many different sources. part of it is an industry problem, and that people don't trust. And I'm sorry, I know that I'm talking to a whole lot of insurance people, but there's a significant proportion of the population that don't trust insurance advisors, and that's part of the problem. So that when they talk to the insurance advisor and get told that you need X amount of insurance, it just seems unbelievable. And partly that's because the sort of numbers that you're talking about, which are quite realistic, just sound so huge to people who don't understand where they come from. And so that's part of the problem. So lack of trust, lack of financial literacy, and I think that's something that as a country we're working on. But part of the problem is that we tend to focus on literacy around the investment side and preparing for retirement. We're not doing it so much on the protection side, and we need to do that as well. So I think it's about broadening some of what we're already doing. I'm not sure that there's a specific sales approach, but there is a need to try and get to people at a younger age, and because one, it will be a little bit easier for them. But I think it's the age at which we're getting to them rather than a particular route. But that will obviously alter according to the age that you're dealing with.
I think, Russell, if I can, just to add to what Claire has just said there, I think it is a reality that the providers and, we have historically focused on building, and developing the highest quality products. Now, in reality, the highest quality products, with, wide range of benefits, for the policyholders comes at a cost. I think, we've missed an opportunity, and we're now having to focus in on that. How do we make sure that we can build really effective product for, people's needs, but make sure that it is at a price point and through, as I said earlier, through an engagement channel, which allows those people to be able to engage with it. I think, part of it is making it real to the people who are trying to buy it. And Claire, you spoke about trust. It's that issue isn't one just to advisors; it's across the whole of financial services, to be blunt. And the providers are wrapped up in that as well. And we need to be able to work on that and make sure that we do build that trust, and make sure that we can simply and effectively talk about why it's important for the person that's being engaged to think about protecting their future self.
Fantastic. I see we're getting some comments around trust and developing low-cost innovative solutions in the chat as well, which is fantastic to see. Kresh, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. And actually really great comments from Tony and Claire. And I might put up my second slide, actually, because this just really shows some evidence behind the comments that both Tony and Claire have made just now. And again, this is specifically on the mortality gap, but on the left you can see, where the gap is the biggest is in younger age groups, and it's those with high incomes. But for me, and this goes to exactly what you were saying, Tony, the chart on the right really brings it home, because it's not just that high income young age group bracket where the issue is. It is that low income group where there is actually arguably an even bigger problem. But I guess, as you said, Tony, the gain in terms of closing the gap is less here because the gaps are smaller, purely because the incomes are lower. But in terms of the number of New Zealanders in each of these groups, there are just as many people in that low income group as there are in that high income group, if not more. So I'm totally in agreement with what you've said. I think we talk a lot about inclusivity these days, and I think it's about time we extended that to insurance, and we think about how we design products that meet the needs of those people who haven't been able to access insurance in the past, because we've focused on all the bells and the whistles and being the best we can be at products, but when actually a lot of New Zealanders need something pretty simple, and they need something simple to remove that uncertainty for them, and actually to protect them from what could be some really dire consequences and probably even worse consequences in that group than there could be in the higher income groups in the case of a shock.
Fantastic. And there's a few comments there about, sort of financial literacy and the role of that in terms of bridging that perception gap as well. And sort of also in reaching back to Tony's comments about, whether or not we're good at reaching particular groups in society and providing both, say, affordable products or affordable advice, for example, as well, which leads me to sort of a slightly provocative question, which is that around the protection gap, sometimes there's a risk that there's a little bit of concern about, is it the consumer that's not getting it? So, is it us or is it them? And who's got to change in order to bridge this perception gap? And what role do we have in improving financial literacy so that we can bridge this? And for that, maybe I should start with you, Dr. Claire.
I think it's both sides. So I think there is a need for consumers to improve their knowledge and to get a better understanding. But I think there is a need also from the industry side to provide information and to simplify the way we talk about it and to ensure that we are providing information and to use stories, because that's the best way. The problem is that you can easily use stories about how insurance helped people, but what you really like to do, and it probably isn't going to go down too well, is to use some stories of people who didn't have insurance and what a difference it could have made to them, and to understand that. But the problem is, if people are already down, you don't really want to be picking on them, I guess, essentially. But using the good news stories about how insurance helped doesn't quite convey, I don't think, necessarily to individuals how helpful the insurance was. They almost will see it as they were lucky. They had insurance, so they were fine, and not actually understand fully. So I really think it is both sides. It's individuals, consumers need to improve their knowledge, but as an industry, we need to be providing that information as well in a digestible form.
Tony.
I agree with Claire. But then I'll ask for forgiveness and go, I'll take a slightly different angle. I'll go a little bit King Lear. If nothing changes, nothing changes, right? So, yes, there needs to be education to the consumers. But there has been sporadic, ongoing efforts at that over time, and to be blunt, it really hasn't had the cut through. To me, the long-term solve of this is, as well as education, is around making sure that there are commercial drivers that companies like Partners Life and others identify and can invest in, that builds in product and technology to create accessibility. I think, when we look at our market, it is incredibly well served by the independent advisor market. It has proved the strongest and most resilient channel in the market, but we have seen, if I can be blunt, the banks pull out of, focusing on, risk product and participating in the risk industry. We have a small but growing portion of direct risk. And when you look overseas to markets that have far higher penetration, than us, and don't have the same pervasive, insurance gap, it is, in my view, manifold why that has happened. But a key part of it is that commercial companies have recognised that there are a need to be able to, as I say, access all those people that have needs, and have used channels that are effective in doing that, and importantly built product that is suitable for those people at the right times. And that may mean products that don't have the same level of benefits and coverage that we see today. And Russell, if I can, it may be that we need innovation and development by the rating houses as well, to ensure that products that don't have the same level of benefits aren't seen as worse products per se, or products that aren't as strong from a feature perspective, but may be able to play a far better role at effectively meeting more limited needs of people whose needs at that point don't require all-encompassing risk coverage.
Oh, that's fantastic, and I think perhaps had you seen Bill's question come up in the question and answer, because it was exactly on target, and obviously Bill raises a question around rating houses, and the example I always use is that I quite often stay in 3-star hotels, so we don't have to go 5-star all the time, do we? Especially if it's a question of buying sufficient scope. But on the subject of participant questions, I really want to make sure that we get through a few of those. One of those was just about the role of digital platforms, and also partly about the integration of investment advice and insurance advice. So, we've seen quite some success from the likes of Sharesies and Hatch in terms of tempting the retail investor to jump into the markets and start exploring those, and to a certain extent gamifying that activity. Is there some role for breakthrough technology platforms and tools that advisors can bring to their clients to help us bridge the protection gap as well? I'm not sure who wants to have a go at that one.
I can have a quick go at it, Russell. And again, I guess the reason I wanted to have a go is because there was something that came out in our research that showed very clearly that a lot of younger New Zealanders are very much in favour of digital channels for not only for doing their research, but also for actually going through a process and buying insurance policies as well. So very, very open to that. So because of that, I think yes, on the face of it, yes, we should definitely move with the times and enable those sorts of channels and make them available to customers. I think we also need to be careful though, because even with platforms like Sharesies, over here in Australia, there's eToro as well, and they, it's almost a bit too easy to get into it without fully understanding what you're getting into. So I think if we can build a robust almost education process that sits alongside that digital channel and take a customer step by step through what they're looking at, what they're buying, what their needs are as well, I think that would work. But ideally they should also have access to someone to talk to as well.
Russell, I'll jump in next. I think there are emerging fintechs here, and you've mentioned a couple in, areas of adjacency to risk, which are proving very successful. I think absolutely, there are, we need to take notice and take note and take motivation from, not just the companies that you've touched on here, but also overseas. There are numerous platforms that have proved Europe, America, Asia very successful in being able to provide effective product to consumers in just about all segments really effectively. And I think, as I say, we should take that as both a point of motivation and challenge. Going back to the comment of trust from Claire earlier, some of these brands are separating themselves from some of the inherent distrust that financial services holistically may have, and are proving, that they are effectively the consumers or the clients' brand of choice, even if they're not a manufacturer themselves. Obviously they're able to access, all types of product. But I absolutely believe we need to take both the challenge and motivation from it, and it has a huge role to play.
And one of the questions in the chat is that are advisors as a channel seen as a channel really for the wealthy? And is that perhaps both a perception or a real problem in terms of cost? So I see, Dr. Claire, you've unmuted. Would you like to jump in on that?
And I think that's absolutely right. There is a perception that advisors are for the wealthy, and that's a bit of a problem. Some advisors don't help in terms of their approach. And so they actually kind of support that perception. And to an extent, it's not so much that they're for the wealthy, but they are for those that are willing to pay for it. And unfortunately, the wealthy are more likely to be willing to pay for it. And also have, for example, on the wealth side of things, they've certainly got more funds to invest, and therefore the advisor is going to make a better return. So that is a problem, but that's where we need to move, I think, to having more of a fees-based model, because and then for people to understand that there is actually a benefit that you're paying for, which is going to be another challenge to get that message across. But I absolutely think that there is a risk that it is seen as for wealthy rather than Joe Blogs, and that's something that needs to be dealt with. That's where a digital platform, and that's where might be helpful, because that's where Sharesies has really come into its own, because it seems accessible. It doesn't seem like it's for the wealthy. It's for everybody, and it's you've got to try and get something that's going to have that approach.
Russell, I'll just quickly add to that. I think it is again part of the reality. Advisors, and forgive the language, have to work bloody hard at being able to generate the leads. We know that insurance, is sold, not bought, if you forgive the language, but that is a reality of it, because people don't understand the need, and therefore there is a high cost of acquisition that is advisors experience. So again, part of this is how do we make sure that we get the right communication, to those underinsured to understand that they have a need. Perhaps, well, again, I go back to comments I made earlier. I do see very successful advice practices that are targeting communities which have historically had low insurance, and they're doing that very, very well. But again, there are realities around the advisor market and the costs of those businesses in terms of generating business, given the lack of understanding of individuals' needs, that makes fulfillment to all parts of the market through that channel difficult. And therefore, I do think it'll be, success will look like, the advice channel continuing to do, and in fact, growing what they do. I think direct will obviously also be a key part. But as Kresh touched on, I think it isn't just black or white. I think there's the opportunity for both hybrid as well as the, advised and direct, which is a combination of both human and technology.
Another one of the questions from the audience is, does anybody know what the difference is between insurance update in terms of general insurance compared to those numbers perhaps that Kresh shared and that we see when we look at the life insurance protection gap?
I'll take the fifth on that. I don't, Russell, but one of the things I'd probably point out, my personal view, unfortunately, and it's a little bit goes back to the comments of Sharesies, we hop in our vehicles, we live in our houses. They are very tangible touch points of different types of risk, and you're in them every day. It's real, it's manifest. In reality, you do not have a terminal illness diagnosis every day. You do not have a critical illness, and therefore the inherent intangibility of elements of the products that we have today and the needs that they meet make that much more challenging. And certainly in terms of comparison.
Yeah, I mean, that comes back to an age-old problem, selling an intangible product.
And I'd support what Tony's saying. And again, I don't have specific numbers, but I know that when I've talked to groups about financial preparation and things, and I'll say to them that you should have income protection insurance, because your greatest asset is actually your ability to earn an income, and you've got to think about what is your lifetime income. And when you actually put it in those terms, and they suddenly think, oh yeah, I've got my house insured and I've got my car insured, but I've never thought about the fact that actually I need to insure my income earning ability, and it's putting it in those terms. And so I'm reasonably confident that that question's right, that people do insure those things more than they have life insurance.
Claire, while we have you, one of our audience was asking about a tool for assessing the protection gap, which I think is used in one of your courses. Are you familiar with this? Is it something you could elaborate on just a little bit?
Yeah, I saw that question, and so I have been online while we've been talking, having a quick look to see if I could find it. I'm reasonably confident But I can't speak with any absolute certainty, but I'm reasonably confident that it's a tool that Michael Naylor developed actually as a result of the Financial Services Council report that we did 10 years ago. And so on the basis of that, he developed a tool that enables you to assess what level of cover an individual or couple should have. And so I would anticipate that he is using it. I had a look at the course that I would have expected it most likely to be used, and I couldn't see it. But if I think it was Royden is particularly interested, I can make some inquiries and find out more about that. But perhaps Royden could drop me a line and just be a little bit more specific. As does he just want to know it exists? Does he want to know more about it, etc.? And I'll get some information for him.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we love to know about is providing post-conference reading or post-session reading. So, if there are tools or for instance, like also Kresh's research and so on that we can share, that'd be fantastic. Some of the other questions that have come up have been around communication. And if I can wrap those up a bit, because we're coming towards the end of our time. Obviously, communication is a key area for us. For as long as there's been insurance, there have been some great debates about how to address this. But with particularly the protection gap kind of lens, maybe we can talk about what do we think the right communication strategies are. And maybe I should go, I haven't heard from you, Kresh, for a little while. So back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. With communication, I'm with Tony. I think we need to start talking to our kids and educating our kids. First of all, I'd love to see, insurance principles and products being taught and shared even at the high school level. I think it's now a basic life skill, really, to know that insurance is out there and is something that can protect you throughout life. I know we've talked about this a lot, but sharing the stories and insurance has never been a exciting topic to bring up when you're with your friends and family. But I think if we can't do it, if we can't start those conversations, then it's going to be very difficult for the rest of New Zealand. So I would just say, for us, for everyone on the call, start that backyard barbecue conversation, share those good news stories as well, because that's what educates people and encourages them that the industry is there to support them.
Fantastic. And Dr. Claire, some words from you in terms of what you think the most important communication issues are, and then we'll go to Tony to wrap up.
God, I'm not sure I can say what the most important communication issues are. Perhaps one of the things I'd suggest is that as an industry, it might be worth having a chat with the Retirement Commissioner. And because the reality is, if you don't have sufficient insurance protection, then you are going to it's going to have an impact on your retirement. So I think you need to talk to the Retirement Commissioner and get it brought into all the work that is being done by the Retirement Commission. And then it can get better information on the Sorted website, etc. Because an amazing number of people use the Sorted website. And so if you can use those communication channels, there's something that's going out there. The focus is on retirement, so you've got to give it that perspective. It's not going to address everything in terms of the insurance protection gap, but it is going to be a significant assistance, I believe.
Fantastic. Tony, can you wrap it up for us?
Okay. I'll lob some stones around to finish. I guess in some ways, Russell, it's the approach to operate at the bottom or the top of the cliff. So I think we as an industry, and we need to work with the New Zealand media on this, need to demand more of government in terms of the role that they play around addressing the overall financial literacy issue. Because as we've said during this conversation, the protection gap is only a part of that. I think as an industry, we need to coordinate better, and whether it's how various industry bodies, the FSC, fans, others actually coordinate activity. There are always constraints on budgets, but how do we get the most out of combining resources to address this issue? Because it's an issue that we're clearly all focused and passionate about, and one that if we know we solve a big issue for a wider, longer term New Zealand. And then I think, there are opportunities that we already have around, things like Money Week and others. How do we actually really make those stand out, get behind them, all of us take accountability for getting behind them and making those the platforms, additional to what Claire's saying in terms of, working with the Retirement Commissioner, etc. How do we make those a standing point and a platform to talk to New Zealand loudly and clearly around the issues that we've been discussing today?
Fantastic. It's been a wonderful discussion. I really do appreciate all of you that have been able to join us here today, and especially our panelists. So I'm going to hand over to Pete Doherty of Fidelity Life.
Kia ora katoa. I'm Pete Doherty. I'm the Chief Customer at Fidelity Life. Our purpose is to help New Zealanders enjoy a more rewarding life, and implicit in that is helping address the protection gap for all New Zealanders. So we're really proud to sponsor this session, and I want to say a big thank you to all of the panelists for all of your contribution. We heard some key themes around awareness, understanding, accessibility, and trust. And they're really important for us to remember as we try and address the protection gap. Claire gave us the context of the big picture, the macro, and the importance of understanding the definition of the protection gap, and that it's not just a lack of insurance, but inadequate or incomplete cover. Kresh gave us a rundown of some of the wonderful research that SwissRe have done in the protection gap, both from within the New Zealand market and also the international context of that. And then Tony reflected on the micro level, and I think it's really important to remember that tackling the big picture will help, but it won't help resolve it. And so actually addressing each individual's needs and concerns is just as important as addressing the bigger pictures of just awareness and education. Last, just to say thank you to Russell for kind of running the session, and I would advise everybody to check out the SwissRe paper, because it's a great piece of work, and also a very personal thanks to Tony for actually taking a very personal angle and making some of this actually feel really, really real. So thank you to all of you guys.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pete. And we really appreciate the support of Fidelity Life. Obviously, the FSC is a member organisation, and this session and the conference as a whole wouldn't be possible without your support. So once again, thank you very much, Kresh Wright of SwissRe, Tony Arthur of Partners Life, and Dr. Claire Matthews of Massey University. Thank you very much for joining us on the panel, and we really do hope that you continue to join us for some of the upcoming sessions. There's some on the screen there. Next week, of course, we see the rise of the retail investor and their power, and especially the workplace savings session, which is coming up as well. And so thank you very much from me, and we'll wrap it up there.